Thanks, Debbie. I'm Terri Pepper, and I am the CEO of TerraLex, a global law firm network. I'm also a member of the college's content generation committee. I think that's our name, right, Chris? And so I'm happy to present this program today. Our guest is Dr. Larry Richard, and some of you who know me know that Dr. Larry has had a profound impact on my professional career, actually on my entire life, because I've learned more from him than probably anyone I ever met in my career. And he's helped me do things like improve my resilience and overcome lots of challenges. So I'm very happy to bring him to the college today. And Dr. Larry, as we call him, is the founder and CEO of LawyerBrain LLC, which is a consulting firm that serves premier law firms and corporate legal departments in the areas of leadership, change management, teams and collaboration, talent selection and development, feedback, motivation, and lawyer resilience and well-being. Many of you, probably everyone on this call, knows that Dr. Larry is recognized as the leading expert on the psychology of lawyer behavior. I dare say that there's rarely a conference in this industry that I go to where someone doesn't quote Dr. Larry or cite Dr. Larry's research and work that he's done. So he's widely known and widely followed, and rightfully so. So I'm going to just kick this off. The way that we're going to handle this today is that it's going to be a fireside chat. And one of the things that Larry's known for is his ability to distill sort of cutting edge scientific principles into actionable recommendations. So you'll hear a little bit of that. It's all around improving performance. I have a whole series of questions I'll be asking. We hope to leave some time at the end for Q&A, but at any point, if you do have a question or you want a little additional commentary on something that we've covered, you can put it in the chat and I'll be monitoring that, or just raise your virtual hand and at appropriate time, I can stop and we can call on you. So let's get cranking. So hi, Larry. Welcome to the program today.
Hi, Ter. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Larry and I have done a lot of programs together over the years, and we are old and good friends. So it feels like I'm interviewing a member of the family, actually.
Well, we often joke that Terri finishes my sentences or I finish hers. And today we decided let's actually do that as a structure.
There you go. So I think it'd be interesting for everyone to hear about what got you interested in helping dysfunctional law firms. How did that all get started?
Well, it goes back to graduate school. As a lot of you know, I practiced law for 10 years. I was a litigator, didn't really like it, even though I come from a family of lawyers. And when I changed careers, I was going to go and get a degree in psychology, which back then, the only thing I knew was clinical psychology. And a friend of mine from high school, I had dinner with him one night, and he had just graduated from Temple University's program in organizational psychology. And I said, what the heck is organizational psychology? I had never heard of that. And he said, think of it as doing therapy with an organization. And I dropped my fork and literally I said, I didn't know you could do that. And at that time, I had applied to 9 different schools for clinical programs. I literally, this shows my poor judgment, I literally pulled my application from all 9 schools, applied to Temple, and luckily got in. And I went through the same program that Dick did and earned my degree in organizational psychology. And the focus, organizational psychology focuses on things like how do teams work? How do you bring out the best in people to get maximum performance in the workplace? What do you do to deal with dysfunctional behavior? That's one of the 3 legs of the stool that animates organizational behavior studies. And so that's what I was trained in. And I was talking to somebody from a small firm in Denver at an ABA conference once, right after I had graduated. And I was telling them, I'm so excited, I've got this new degree, but I have no idea what to do with it. And she said, well, what do you do? And I started talking about the studies we had done in dysfunctional behavior. She said, oh my God, you've described my firm to a T. And I said, well, I've never done one of these before, but I'm happy to come in and see if I can help you. And she said, we're so desperate, we'd hire the dog catcher. So I got hired in this firm and I spent a couple of months working with them and was able to have a very successful outcome. And honest to goodness, this one firm, my contact there was the law firm administrator. And she probably referred me to a dozen other clients just from that one engagement. And of course, all of those dozen clients were about dysfunctional behavior. There are a lot of other things I was trained in and interested in, but it kind of set my course at the very beginning, just because that's what, if your first contact with somebody is they do X, then you tell everybody else, oh, I know this person who does X. And there was no oxygen for all of the other expertise until later in my career. So that's how I got started.
Well, and it's interesting, for those of you who are joining now, we were saying at the beginning that some people don't like to attend seminars like this because if someone in their firm finds out, they may think they're accusing their firm of being dysfunctional. But I pretty much know almost everybody on this screen here, and I know none of us would say that our firms are dysfunctional, but there certainly is dysfunctional behavior within every law firm, and I've worked with thousands of them. So what are the various types of dysfunctional behavior, and what are some of the warning signs that people should be on the lookout for? Not anyone on this screen, of course, not their firms.
Of course, I'm sure everybody on this call is attending on behalf of a friend, not on behalf of themselves or their own firm. But the kinds of dysfunctional behavior we see are many and varied. I'll mention the most significant, most obvious ones. Number one is conflict. And lawyers are really trained in conflict. I mean, that's what we do, right? Litigation is a practice area. Not everybody's a litigator, but everybody's trained to think like a litigator. Law school teaches you the adversarial mindset. And so we all have that training. We have training in thinking skeptically. And over the years, I've studied lawyers' personality traits, and the number one trait, which is atypically high compared to the public, is high skepticism. So conflict, and by the way, the most recent trait to become a statistical outlier is low empathy. Lawyers are dramatically low and getting lower in empathy. And when you combine low empathy with high skepticism, you get conflict. It just comes with the territory in the practice of law. And the low empathy that's, kind of running rampant in more recent years has made it much harder for firms to fix this themselves. Because the number one tool, in fact, really the only tool that fixes dysfunctional behavior is taking the perspective of others. That's the solution in every one of these projects that I've undertaken. I mean, there are variations, there are window dressing, there's a lot of other pieces to it. There are things that you do to get perspective taking activated, but the core is when I see the experience you're having and understand that's why you behave that way, not because of the judgments I made about you, then I can shift my own way of relating to you. And so given that there's a drop in the personality trait that permits that type of perspective taking approach, we're seeing conflict a lot. The second type is low morale, and low morale can come about for many different reasons. So take Strzok just closed after 117 years. Very sad. I love that firm. And the way they dissolved is the way that many firms have dissolved fairly quickly, because people started losing trust in the potential of the firm for the future. And when big rainmakers leave a firm because they've lost trust, then other people start worrying about it, and it cascades. And in a very short time, a firm can go from very healthy and well-respected to emptying out the offices. So low morale usually precedes these blowups. And low morale can also come about from poor leadership. Poor leadership is right up there as one of the main causes of low morale. When people don't feel that you hear me, when I don't have input into the way the firm is governed, that can produce low morale. When there is inequity, unfairness is one of the primary causative factors in some of the research on employee engagement. So if I feel unfairly treated, unfairly compensated, unfairly paid attention to, unfair in terms of the resources that I have access to, that can produce low morale. Let's go back to resources for a second. If I don't have the right resources to do my work, if I'm a litigator and it requires, say, lots of office space to spread out my files and prepare a case, And they say, no, we're treating everybody equally. You don't get any more space than anybody else does. I feel like, hey, you're not really understanding my need. And that can produce low morale. Low morale can be produced from some silly things when firms merge or you bring in another practice. And because lawyers are also low in resilience, we're thin-skinned, and we don't like telling somebody no. So you bring in a new practice, and now you have your legacy litigation department head, and you have the new department head from the group you're bringing in. What you should do is figure out which of those leaders is the best one for the overall litigation practice, and kindly and gently find a better way for the other leader to rehabilitate him or herself. But what we do is we say, oh, we can just make it co-leadership. And so co-leadership for the wrong reason, and there are a lot of law firms that do co-leadership to avoid discomfort rather than because it's a strategically good choice. When you do it to avoid discomfort, people can feel the tension between the leaders. People can feel the kind of dysfunctionality that type of leadership brings with it, and that can lower morale. When there is an elephant in the room, when something happens that's embarrassing or bad, or there's nepotism, or there is two partners are having an affair, or something that cannot be talked about openly, it often will lower morale in the firm because it's secret, and it's really hard on your emotional well-being when people have to harbor secrets. Third, when there are changes in the firm that don't get buy-in. So a firm decides to imperiously mandate a change in the comp system. Well, the people who benefit are delighted, but the people who are not beneficiaries of that change or even suffer from that change often will start a whispering campaign as they talk to their fellow negatively affected colleagues. And you start getting dysfunctionality because you have a faction that's formed. So those are a couple of them. Like I said, there are lots of other forms of dysfunctionality. We've had dysfunctional firms where there have been argues about comp. That's a very common one. Dysfunctionality because of new firms that merged and leadership didn't do a good job of integrating the new firms, and they still talk in we, they terms months or even years after the merger. My favorite was a firm that approached me and said, the younger partners were annoyed at the older partners because the older partners were taking a lot out of the firm, but working far fewer hours. They were cutting back on their hours. And the younger partners that were known in the firm as the Young Turks resented that they weren't getting paid, quote, their fair share. So they went off and had their own retreat secretly and decided that based on the partnership agreement, there was a clause in there that said that if they got a certain critical mass, they could vote the existing leadership out of office, literally out of office. One vote, and that would be the end of the leadership. And they decided they were going to form this cabal and vote leadership out of office. And they miscounted the votes. They assumed that one partner in one of their branch offices was on board, and he was just actually one of these guys who, was very agreeable, and they came to him and said, here's what we're planning to do. Does that sound like a good idea? And he would say, yeah, that sounds good. And they never asked him if he really, in his heart of hearts, would vote in that direction. They just assumed that he was on board, and he voted in the other direction. He didn't think it was a good idea. And so here they are with complete egg on their face. They've now tried to, kneecap the existing management, and they failed. And everybody's walking around the hallway with their head down. Nobody wants to interact with anybody else. It was the most uncomfortable, awkward place you could imagine. And we had to do, psychological surgery, in effect, to repair the dysfunctionality in that firm. So it can be very serious, or it can be, light, and it also depends on size. In a small firm, you can't hide these types of problems. When you get to a large firm with multiple offices, multiple practices, and large headcount, you can often have pockets of dysfunctionality that people locally know about, but the broad firm doesn't really even hear about it.
I'm having a PTSD attack because my very first law firm in the late 1980s, every single thing you described was a circumstance at that firm. And they went into a partner meeting on a Saturday in December and came out dissolved. They dissolved the
Wow.
partnership with no previous thought to do so. So yeah, it can happen. So interestingly, and I'm gonna, Larry and I had a set of questions, but Larry, I'm gonna jump ahead a little because I think one of the questions
Sure.
on here I want to bring up to the forefront because it ties in with what you're talking about. And not that, we see this too often, but what can be done about sort of the abusive, intimidating, narcissistic, or insensitive partners? Can they improve? And I've been in a lot of firms where I've seen a lot of that. It's very awkward and uncomfortable.
So that is definitely another one of the kind of buckets in terms of kinds of dysfunctional behavior. These days, we're seeing much more extremes in the range from low comp to high comp. In other words, the highly compensated partner has become much more of a thing. There are stars that get star treatment. And in some firms, the way that happens really builds the ego of these big rainmakers and makes them think that they own the place. And some of them have either personalities that just kind of, when they're rewarded in this way, they get insensitive. There's actually some research showing that the more power someone has in an organization, the less empathy they have. And so when you get a large rainmaker who starts to think of, and I'm going to say himself, because 9 out of 10 times, I can remember one woman rainmaker that I dealt with that had this problem. Every other one I can think of was a male. So it can happen with women, but it's much more infrequent. So when it goes to his head, he can act in a way that is extremely insensitive, extremely abusive, demanding things, pressuring people, recruiting associates and saying, you work for me and you will not work for anyone else. And if you take work from another partner, you're out of this practice, things like that, becoming very, very, domineering and demanding and sometimes cruel. Now, can it be fixed? In some cases, the answer is no. Some of these situations involve people who have clear personality disorders. A personality disorder is basically a psychological problem that's very tenacious and baked in. And therapy is not going to help them. You can possibly soften it for a brief period of time, but it's always going to be there. It's always going to have the potential to reemerge. Contrast that with people who are normal people who just, activated kind of their worst side. And those people, you can kind of pull them out of the abyss and help them recover. It takes empathy and compassion to work with them. It also takes giving them very pointed feedback, which lawyers are often reluctant to do. We can do that by live 360s, where I go around and interview people with their permission and then roll it up anonymously and give them feedback. Here's how you're perceived by your partners. Here's what the staff says about you, and so forth. And sometimes that can have a very powerful, dramatic impact. I've had a couple situations where a partner literally reformed on the spot just by hearing the feedback. For others, it's more tenacious. They're more low in resilience, and they can't hear all of that feedback at once. And it takes slowly building up their capacity to hear feedback so that they can start to say, oh, okay, the way I'm doing things is probably not the best. So some of them can be fixed. Some, I'm afraid, are impossible. And then you have to make a call. Do we tolerate that, given that it has some very expensive and costly consequences? Are we going to keep that partner here and tolerate his misbehavior because we want the revenue, or do we insist on principles and say, I'm sorry, that's not acceptable, you're going to have to find another home?
We have actually got a question from a group of people watching together, and then I'm going to come back to this notion about how leaders
Sure.
handle those dysfunctional people. The question is, to what do you attribute the recent decrease in empathy?
So there are a lot of possible reasons. There's no definitive study on this. There is some research. And so let me mention some of the things that it is attributed to. Number one, social media is a big culprit. Social media tends to produce isolation. In other words, we only log into social media feeds that reinforce the things that we already believe. In the old days, we had to expose ourselves to a wide array of views, and we kind of got used to the fact that people think differently than the way we do. But in a social media-driven world, we can actually start to believe, falsely, but start to believe that all, quote, good people think like I do. And when we encounter somebody who thinks differently, we scorn them. We go tribal and we look at it as we, they. So that's a loss in empathy, because we're not really allowing ourselves to hear their viewpoint. Think of, by analogy, the way news is delivered today. It's delivered through all kinds of media. Some people get it through Facebook, some people get it through other social media feeds, some people get it through NPR, some people get it through the TV, the evening news, some people get it through radio, some people get it through email, all different things. 20 years ago, there were 3 main networks and a couple of subsidiary networks that delivered news. And almost everybody in America got their news from one of these mainstream sources, and they had to hear centrist delivery of that news, including a little bit of the right and a little bit of the left. And so things were more homogenized then. So that's one thing, is the social media influence. Number two, there has been a decline in the experiences that produce empathy. People used to live in extended families in their homes. Now we have more people living alone than living in families or living in couples. When you're living alone, you don't have any role models. You don't have people to teach you. Contrast that with living in 2 or 3 generations of people in your family where people correct you. I was just listening to a podcast the other day, and one of the older participants in the podcast was talking about, my father used to wash my mouth out with soap if I said a curse word or behaved inappropriately, literally with soap. You don't have that in today's world. And so we don't have the vehicles for learning perspective taking that we used to have in the old days. There are a couple of other possible theories from the research, but those are the main ones. And it's affecting not just lawyers, it's affecting the whole world. There was a study 10 years ago that showed that empathy has declined every single year for the past 10 years for millennials, people 40 years and younger, partly for the reasons that I mentioned, partly for some other reasons. And so given that millennials right now constitute 90 to 100% of most law firms' associate classes, this is a group with no empathy. And when we told millennials the findings of that study, of course, their reaction was, yeah, whatever. Sorry, my one empathy joke.
It was funny. So I have an anonymous comment that I'll share, but I just wanted to quickly share my washing my daughter's mouth out with soap story. I one time decided to try it, but I used liquid soap. So she had the best time blowing bubbles and didn't think it was a punishment at all. Lesson learned.
Oh my goodness. Just don't swallow, right?
Yeah. Here's an anonymous piece of feedback in relation to your comment about more men being dysfunctional in law firms. And this writer says, as one who's been in the industry for 3 decades, I've actually experienced more women leaders being abusive and without empathy than men in the past 15 years. I don't believe it is gender-based. It's enabled behavior. So I don't know if you want to react to that or not.
I'm delighted. No, I'm delighted to hear that. I just haven't seen it in my practice.
Okay, fair enough. And tell us, and you touched on this a bit, but what are some things that law firm leaders get wrong about dealing with this dysfunctional behavior, and what can or should they be thinking about doing differently?
So a couple of wrong things. Number one, the biggest mistake that law firms make, and this comes from the law firms themselves, not from me. I ask them, when we help resolve one of these things, is there anything you would have done differently? And the most frequent thing that I hear is, yes, I would have addressed this problem sooner than I did. In other words, leaders let these things fester for too long, hoping that it will go away, hoping that it'll be fixed with comp, hoping that it'll be fixed with, begging or pleading, hoping that it will fix itself, and it never does. So waiting too long is the number one thing. Number two, trying to use persuasion or coercion as a tool to resolve these problems. Both of those are failed strategies to fix dysfunctional behavior. I wrote a blog post a couple of months back called "Why You Should Never Try to Persuade Your Lawyers." And I talked about not using persuasion, not using coercion, and what was the third thing? Not using
a hard stick with metal on the end.
Well, something else. Probably incentives. Incentives and coercion are basically another names for carrot and the stick. So the three of those strategies for influencing lawyers, especially influencing them to behave more functionally, they really don't work. Persuasion doesn't work because, number one, lawyers are trained in arguing. And when you try to persuade them, they don't go, oh, well, that's a really rational persuasion, really rational argument. I'll reform my behavior. What they do is they say, okay, you finished? Here are 3 reasons why you're wrong. The second thing that happens when you try to persuade a lawyer is 90% of lawyers that I study are low in resilience. And when you try to persuade a low resilience lawyer, there's a distortion that occurs. If I try to tell you, you need to do this way, what the lawyer hears is you are deficient. And if somebody tells you you're deficient, it's not persuasive. You're not going to follow their request. So persuasion doesn't work. And coercion doesn't work because it sets up, first, it feels like pressure to people, and lawyers have extraordinarily high autonomy compared to the general public, and they definitely don't want to be pressured into anything, and they often will do just the opposite. And incentives don't work because, believe it or not, incentivizing, giving rewards, if you do this, then I'll reward you, is also actually experienced as pressure by people, because people feel like I have to do this behavior to get the reward instead of feeling I get to do this behavior. And anytime someone feels like I have to, you're not getting their heart and mind, you're only getting the inducement by the reward, and that doesn't fix the behavior. You can't fix the behavior without changing the inner psychology of the person, and none of those 3 methods do that.
So here's a question from the audience that's very close to my own heart, because you helped me with extremely low resilience, and now I'm a tough cookie. But the question is, how might you advise how to evaluate whether someone has enough resilience to receive feedback and or to be fixed? And how do you help someone grow or build resilience?
Well, first of all, let's just stipulate that most lawyers don't have enough resilience to get feedback without getting defensive. It's just part of what happens with lawyers. the reason the resilience is so low is because skepticism is one of the major factors that pushes resilience to its low end. And lawyers are trained in skepticism, selected for being skeptical, they rehearse skepticism every day. They use it in their job every day. So it's a daily tool that we use to be good lawyers. And given that, we're constantly lowering our resilience. There's nothing you can do about that, but you can build up resilience. So it's not like there's a way you can prevent lawyers from reacting in a thin-skinned way, but, well, actually there is by being respectful, empathic, and compassionate. But even then, some lawyers may have such a strong filter that they hear the criticism behind a compliment. There are many, many strategies that you can use to build resilience. And I should make a small plug for a book that I just finished writing that the ABA asked me to write last year, which is about why lawyers are so low in resilience, in the trait of resilience, and what you can do to raise their resilience. So there are a couple of things that can be done. Number one, changing the mindset. And this takes some work because it's based on the cognitive behavioral model that psychologists use. If you're familiar with CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, it's a evidence-based form of talk therapy that has about 50 years of evidence behind it showing that it actually helps people improve their psychological state. And it basically involves the premise that thoughts and feelings are connected, not separate, independent, functioning behaviors. When we change our thinking, we actually change the emotional response that we have. And so if you train people to change their thinking, it will change their psychological affect, including their low resilience. So one way that we build resilience in lawyers is to understand what's the current dialogue in their head, the jukebox that's going through their head. So, for example, if you criticize a lawyer and their internal voice says, oh, God, I probably deserve that, I'm no good, what else could they say? So by teasing out what's the voice in your head saying and what could that voice say instead, now let's rehearse that voice so it becomes more automated. So when the trigger event occurs next time, the good voice happens instead of the bad voice. And that in that way, you can start to reform it. So one mechanism for building resilience is CBT. Another one that may shock lawyers is the research shows that social connection, having warm, authentic, vulnerability-based relationships. That is where I show my true emotions to you, even though it's risky, and we build trust and connection around that authenticity. In firms that have that, mainly because a leader is authentic emotionally and can build those kinds of connections with his or her constituents, with leaders at other levels, that tends to build this sense of, I'm in a trusted place, I'm in a psychologically safe place. And the trust that follows from psychological safety tends to produce highly functional interactions among people. Dysfunctionality occurs when it doesn't feel psychologically safe. So one of the key strategies for repairing dysfunctional behavior is, number one, to do some really good active listening to people who are, basically disgruntled. And what I do when I go into a firm is and there are lots of different techniques and strategies. So I'm just going to give you the general principle. I try to, in each of my conversations with people, I try to listen in a way that lets them feel completely heard and understood. And then I train the leaders to do the same thing. Because when somebody feels like you understand the concern that I'm raising, it doesn't solve it, but it goes a long way toward building the trust that does eventually solve it. Without that sense of you understand me, if it's just a he said, she said, debate, or if it's an argument, Arguments never, ever solve these dysfunctional problems. The only thing that ever solves them is when you can bring the parties together and help them to understand each other. So the first step is always hearing people. Then once people start feeling heard, then we start having a dialogue. And usually what happens in those dialogues is people start to realize, I made a misassumption. I thought you meant this, or I thought you believed this, or I thought your motive was this. And in these dialogues, we often learn some things about each other that we didn't know before that reframe how we think about the relationship. But it's really easy when you don't have that dialogue, when you don't have that trust, it's really easy to put someone else in the doghouse, to create a narrative around why somebody is so evil or mischievous or negative or bad or not to be trusted. And it's often much more complex than those superficial attributions that we make. And the process of repair is getting us out of the superficial, expanding an understanding of each other so that we understand each other as complex human beings and are a little bit more tolerant and trusting.
You know, Larry, I remember when we were working through my low resilience many years ago, and you recommended a book that it still holds true today, because I just recommended it to someone who needed to have it. And it was besides your book. I highly recommend that one. But this other book, Change Your Questions, Change Your Life. Do you remember?
Yep.
Marley's
Yep.
Adams? Highly recommend that. The problem is the person who has the low resilience needs to want to change out of that. So, and even be willing to read the book.
That's
but
true.
It is a good book to give someone on their your Christmas or Hanukkah list.
Yeah, I can give you the book. The author's name is Marilee, Marilee Adams, and it's a really, really good book. It boils down to one basic idea, which is she calls it judger learner. It's a mindset. A judger mindset is a mindset that says, I'm waiting. When you're speaking, I'm waiting to counter you. I'm trying to generate my arguments against you. In learner mode, I'm listening to you. I'm trying to understand what you're saying and why you're saying it the way you're saying it. In judger mode, I'm trying to find what's wrong with you. In learner mode, I'm saying, what are your strengths? What do you do well? And she goes through all of these different examples of judger versus learner. And learner mode is the mindset that allows people to work through differences. Judger mode is the mindset that causes differences. Excellent.
So let's, I don't think let's see. Well, all right. I want to leave some time to talk about groups and teams, but I do want to, I love these questions that are coming in. So here's one. Is there any advice for a firm when they're thinking about revamping their compensation model that, if the model might create opportunities for some, but then de-equitize other? How do you manage not the actual physical changing of the comp model, but the things that happen as a result of doing that?
So a couple of points. Number one, I'm not a compensation expert. I'm not a comp consultant, but I often work with people who are, because adjusting comp requires a lot of deep expertise in what types of compensation works for what types of structures. But it also has to take into account the fact that when you do a compensation process, it's having a psychological effect in two ways on lawyers. The first way is the actual comp, the finished product. Am I being fairly compensated or not? And that can affect the lawyer's psychological reaction, but also the way that you go about it. Does the average lawyer in the firm have visibility into the comp process, or is it done in secret? Do they have input into that process? Do people interview them and say, what would you like? Do they have some feeling that I am respected as this process is going on? Do they feel like people truly understand their contribution, especially their non-economic contributions? Or do they feel like the people who are best at getting known are the ones that are going to get rewarded? So the process, in my view, is much more important than the actual dollars and cents at the end of the line in dictating whether people feel accepting of the new comp system. So the main thing is pay attention to the process, pay attention to buy-in, pay attention to keeping people informed about the process. The next point is that when you go through a revamp of comp, it always, always, always helps to test it before it's rolled out. Rolling it out top down and saying, we've decided and here's what it is a surefire way to get alienation. So do a test balloon. We're thinking of this. And even before you get to the point of a test balloon, you can also solicit input and say, the reason we're revisiting the comp system is we run into these issues and we're trying to resolve them. And we think adjusting comp will resolve them, but we want to know, do people have other ideas? Sometimes there are non-comp solutions to resolve issues that we think are comp issues. So it always helps to get input from the people who are going to be regulated by the comp system, because the most excellent way to get buy-in is by asking people who are affected by any decision.
So speaking of psychological safety, I've sent a note off to Debbie, a chat, that we're not going to download or share the chat log, since most of the questions coming in, the person asking is asking that I maintain their confidentiality. So we will not.
Great idea. Them. Thanks.
Yeah. Larry, here's another question. Are you seeing younger lawyers listening less to the spoken word and more to the actual actions or deeds of partners, management, and leadership?
That's a hard one to answer, Tara. I'm not sure I would say listening less to the spoken word. I would say listening less, period. Millennials, in my experience, and the complaints I get about millennials from senior lawyers is that they don't listen. And part of this is the low empathy. I was just talking to somebody last week who was saying, I told one of my associates that I needed her attention immediately, and she blew me off. She said, I have something else to do. And he's like, in my associate years, if I ever said that, I would be kicked out of the firm, or at least I felt I would be. But there's more of a kind of an uppity attitude. In other words, in the old days, at a lot of the white shoe firms, people would refer to lawyers by their surname, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so. Today, it's all first name basis, especially by the youngest lawyers. And so there's kind of a cultural norm that hasn't been discussed. It's kind of an unwritten disconnect between the older and younger generations, where the younger generation is more informal and more, I'll make my own rules myself, thank you. Non-hierarchical. Now, it's tricky. The first name thing is tricky because sociologists tell us that use of a first name can have two very different, almost opposite psychological meanings in a workplace. One meaning of a first name basis is superiority. So if I am higher in status than you, I address you by your first name, and I ask you to address me by my surname. In every culture in the world, using a surname and a first name differential signals I have higher power or higher status than you do. But the rub is in the fact that there's also a social norm in many cultures that first name can also signal intimacy. I'm on a friendly basis with you, so I call you Terry. I don't call you Ms. Pepper. And if I called you Ms. Pepper, you'd look at me and go, what's gotten into you, right? Because we have established a comfort level that we're on a first name basis. And so a first name is welcome as a signal of our more friendly connection. If I don't know you and I say Terry, I'm probably violating the norm of status because I haven't established the right to use the informal Terry. I'm now using the up and down Terry, which is a violation of my status in this organization. So it's tricky because you've got these two very different meanings of the first naming norm. And if it's not called out explicitly, it creates real angst among people.
I was thinking when you were saying that of my first law firm, the same one that dissolved, and it was all Mr. this, Miss that, Mrs. whatever. And there was 2 Peppers, a Piper, and a Tepper. So when the receptionist would page, Miss Pepper, Mr. Pepper, Miss Tepper, Miss Piper, we'd all pick up the phone and say, was that me? So there's
Oh
a
my goodness.
downside to that. Well, we have a little bit of time left, and I want to make sure we get to cover working in teams and maybe talk a little bit about why it's so challenging for lawyers to work successfully in teams. And is that different than the rest of us?
It is different from the rest of
Non-lawyers.
us. Yeah, it's different from everybody else. And the reason is the low resilience is one of them, the skepticism. There was a study done by Google called the Aristotle Project. And this was a remarkable process. Hold on just a second. I've got to turn off. There we go. The Aristotle Project, basically, Google looked at 180 teams in their company and asked the question, what do the best teams do that makes them successful? And they found that there were 5 factors. The number one factor was psychological safety, meaning I feel like it feels psychologically non-threatening for me to be myself, to say things different from what the rest of the group is saying, and so forth. People are not going to tell you their best ideas if they feel they're going to be punished for doing so. And so they found that teams that had psychological safety were the best performing teams. And that criterion was more of a predictor than all of the other 4 criteria combined. So psychological safety was almost magical. The number one factor that produced psychological safety was empathy in the group. In other words, I'm working in a team and I hear somebody else attempt to say something and someone else steps on their comment. A high empathy person would say, Terry, I noticed you tried to say something a minute ago before so-and-so interrupted you. Can I just, go back to that and give you a chance to restate it? That empathic enabling of people, when it happens mutually, is what makes teams really functional. It feels psychologically safe. Well, we have just the opposite because of the low empathy in law firms today. We have everybody juggling to try to get their voice heard, and it feels very unsafe when you have that. So it creates some dysfunctionality for that reason. The other thing that goes on is that because lawyers are low in resilience, and we know that every group has to go through forming, storming, norming, and performing. It's just the way groups develop. And we could do an hour on what that means. But for today, I'll just say that in the beginning of a group, we're tentative and polite until we kind of psychologically know that we're safe. After a while, we suppress our individuality in the beginning of a group because we don't want to get rejected for being different. After a while, we start feeling safe enough to express our differences, and we start doing so, and that creates conflict. And it's that expressing of differences that leads to conflict that starts raising the resilience hackles of low resilience lawyers. If I start feeling empowered in a new group to start speaking honestly and saying, I don't like the way you put that, or I have a better idea than the one you raised, normal people would go, okay, well, let's hear your idea. But a low resilience person just goes, ouch, I'm wounded. And they want to hurt you, or they want to ally with somebody else against you, and you start getting factions forming. So low resilience in law firms is just disabling when it comes to forming teams. It can happen, and it does happen occasionally, but way, way less frequently than you would expect in a normal, healthy organization.
So there's a question along these lines, and both the person who asked the question and myself have wagered a guess as to what you're going to say, so I'll be interested to hear. The question is, why is it that lawyers seem to work out better or well in teams in cases and in court, but they don't do so as well in management or business development or practice groups or et cetera? What's the difference?
So court is a game. It's a game that has ground rules. It has structure. There is a party who on one side and a party on the other side, an adversary, and there's a neutral, a trier of fact, a judge, an arbitrator. So we all learn that structure and we live within that structure because it's how we win. If I can be more persuasive to the trier of fact than the other person, then I win. When we get back in our office, we don't have that neutral. We don't have somebody, walking down the aisle going, well, Terry's comment was actually the better one in this dispute you're having. It's just Terry and somebody else, and you have to work it out yourself. And if we behave in our office the way we behave in a court structure, in a litigation structure, we're going to get under people's skin. The other reason is that lawyers, the number one reason that people go into law is it feeds their intellect and their abstract reasoning. Lawyers are really smart. They're above the IQ curve compared to the public. They go into law because they love analyzing and problem solving and using their brains to solve big problems. So we do that, but remember that the structure is adversarial. So if I go into a courtroom and I argue, and the person who is being argued against, because they're so in love with the analyzing, they believe that they've got an airtight case and they believe that they have a good argument, and they're going to come back at you and going, oh, you poor fool, I can't believe you think that that argument is going to win. Here's my argument. And both lawyers believe that. So in a court structure, no problem. When you have that kind of overconfidence in a conversation in your office, you are going to puncture somebody's balloon, because the low resilience is going to kick in if I criticize somebody else. You don't have the worry about criticism and low resilience in a litigation, because lawyers are so competent and so skilled and so knowledgeable. It's just going to roll off their back. But if the criticism is about interpersonal issues, I don't like the way you said that. I don't like your tone of voice. I don't think you really know enough about this topic. That's going to raise the resilience issue, and it's going to, deflate somebody's sales.
So we have about 6 more minutes. The clock just turned over, and I have another question that's been posed that I'm going to ask. But before I do that, I know people often jump off in the last few minutes because of having to get ready for something at the top of the hour. So I just want to do 2 quick things. One is I just want to mention that the next Futures Conference is in Washington, D.C., March 12th and 13th, and the early bird registration rate deadline is approaching on December 1. So if you haven't registered and you want to try to get that early bird rate, please do that. And also at the end of the session, Debbie's going to put a poll up just to ask you a question about the session. But let me pose this question on behalf of one of our listeners. And if anyone else has any further questions, put them in the chat now. Now's your chance. This question is, doesn't every younger generation challenge established ways? Do you think the generational differences today are greater than generational differences in the past?
It's not what I think. There's science on this. There's research. For years, people said, oh, come on, when we gripe about younger people, give us a break. Younger people are always that way. You were that way when you were that age. And for years, that was actually the truth. A lot of the griping about generational differences devolved on, down to that particular point, that we were just forgetting what we were like as kids. But millennials are the first generation for whom the story changes. They really are different. Their values really are different. There's I think she's a psychologist, Jean Twenge, Twenge. She's probably done the most research on this subject. And she has found that the cohort born from 1982 to today, onward, before you get to the next generation, Gen Z, which is roughly born in 2000, 2002, depending on your author. So people born from 1982 to 2000, they are the first generation to have dramatically different values from previous generations, their age, and that's been documented. So we have to really accept that. And if you treat it just like, oh, it's griping old people who forget what it's like to be young, you're really going to probably end up making a mistake.
So in the last couple of minutes, I'm just going to ask you to maybe sum up your best advice for leaders that are trying to bring out the best in their people. What do they need to be doing? And you've mentioned, of course, some of it, but maybe reiterate some of that.
So I'll mention 4 broad principles, which all are under the category of you want to focus on bringing out the best, not on trying to debate, persuade, induce, demand, or pull behavior from people. That just alienates them, and you're not going to get their best work. There's even neuroscience research showing that that kind of punitive, negative, critical approach shuts down the learning mechanism in the brain and defeats the whole point of trying to goad people into doing good work. What gets good work from people is a supportive, psychologically safe, connected environment. And there are 4 principles of psychology that produce that kind of an environment. Number 1 is giving people as much autonomy as you can possibly give them. And by autonomy, I don't just mean I won't bother you, but you actually have control over some of the things that affect your future. In other words, active ability to influence my future, that kind of autonomy. Number 2 is meaning and purpose. Simple example, if I'm a partner, I'm assigning work to a younger person, I'm not just going to tell you, give me a memorandum on this legal issue. I'm going to say, give me a memorandum on this legal issue, because when you do that, I'm going to give it to this human being, and here's what they're going to do with it, and here's why it matters, and here's how your research is going to have an impact down the road. So you feel like what I did mattered. Number 3, belonging and connection. I want to feel like I belong to some organization, group, practice, office that feels like I'm part of them. They recognize me for who I am. They welcome me. I feel connected to them. And number 4 is mastery and competence. I want to feel like somebody genuinely sees my skill level and understands what I'm trying to master and takes an active interest in helping me become better at my craft. Those 4 things, if you did nothing more than those 4 things, you would have the most engaged, loyal, psychologically safe, healthy workforce, and you wouldn't have any dysfunctionality. Those are literally the psychological solutions. The only one of those 4 that I see consistently done well in law firms, and even that one's not always done well, is the last one, mastery and competence. Law firms do a pretty good job of mentoring, developing lawyers, do good training programs, role modeling, all that stuff. But it could be done better. It could be done with a strengths-based approach, which it usually is not, and so forth.
Thank you. So while I say thank you to Larry, Debbie, you can go ahead and put the poll up. If you would just stay for 1 more minute and take the poll. Larry, thank you so much. You always, as much as you and I have worked together over the years, I still learn something new every single time I speak with you, and I'm sure our audience did as well today. If anyone wants more information or to read some of the things that Larry has written or has talked about today, his website is www.LawyerBrain.com. It's a newly overhauled, beautiful website, so I encourage you to have a look. And until next time, we will appreciate your support of the College of Law Practice Management. Hope to see some of you in March in Washington, D.C.